Good afternoon. Family, I have to tell you, putting the choir and spoken word first is just rude, as my sons would say. I mean, who needs a talk when you have the PoCC Choir? Transporting us through a portal in which we don't simply understand, but we feel our inherent interconnectedness as people and planet. There are powerful forces afoot trying to make us forget this simple truth, that we are all in this burning house together. I might hit the ground before you, but you won't be far behind. So my well-being is intimately connected to yours. We don't need allies. We need everyone to smell the smoke. Music in that way, for me, is memory. A way of remembering who we are to each other. So let's get started here. Who owns the future? For me, a touchstone in thinking about the relationship between technology and society is this simple line by Black feminist writer Toni Cade Bambara. Not all speed is movement. I personally apply that to many areas of my life, both personal and professional. But here I want us to think about it in light of technological speed, the race to create bigger, faster, shinier systems, and all of the things we end up skipping in the process. The questions we don't ask, the communities we don't consult. And so to get started, we have to slow down. We see two images here, one from a prior era of racial domination and inequality in education on your left. And then we see an image from the early weeks of the pandemic when our students were sent home, and in the UK context, they couldn't take their A-level exams, which are similar to our SATs and our ACTs. And so what the government did was they used an algorithm to predict students' grades. And predictably, students that went to more working class schools, diverse schools, their grades were predicted as lower than their wealthier, whiter counterparts. And as you can see here, the students had a lot to say about those algorithms. One sign in particular is very instructive. She's saying our grades do not equal our postal codes, or what we call zip codes. A reminder, an important reminder, that the algorithm or the technology is not creating the inequity from scratch, but is reflecting and reproducing existing forms of inequality that are encoded in the geography of those cities. So any conversation about technology cannot start with the technology. It has to start with the society that produces that technology. And so as we do that, as we think together about the larger social and historical context that we're living in, we have to slow down. Moving beyond all the hype that we're bombarded with in terms of artificial intelligence, and consider other kinds of AIs that don't get a lot of marketing, don't get a lot of hype, including one that I'm a big fan of, ancestral intelligence. Collective wisdom, the know-how that are passed down from generation to generation among communities who are too often buried under the rubble of progress. Another kind of AI, and one that I'm going to spend a little bit more time on today as it intersects with the work that we all do, and that is AI as abundant imagination. Again, doesn't have a big marketing team, not a lot of hype. That's our job. And so let me share with you how I started to think about imagination a little differently than we're often trained. About 16 years ago, when I started my first faculty position, I was trying to learn everything that I could about teaching because somehow they skipped that part in grad school. And I came across a famous study conducted by NASA that was focused on creativity. These researchers were interested in measuring the capacity for what they called divergent thinking. That is the ability to see beyond what's right in front of us and come up with many different ways of thinking through a problem. So they followed a cohort of 1,600 children over many years, giving them a creativity test that was initially designed for NASA recruits. And the results were shocking in that nearly 100% of 5-year-olds fell into the genius category for divergent thinking. More shocking still that each year this percentage dropped until only 12% of 15-year-olds and 2% of adults exhibited this creative capacity. In other words, this inherent genius that we all possess is schooled out of us. The very place we should be able to go to incite our imaginations is the place where it's routinely squashed, ground down, standardized. Not inevitably, but predictably. And it's not just individual students who suffer, it's society as a whole when we don't heed these words by Toni Morrison. As you enter positions of trust and power, dream a little before you think. So what if we took imagination seriously, not as flights of fancy or something reserved only for self-proclaimed artists, but imagination as a muscle, a capacity, a resource? How might the power of our collective imagination begin to transform the world around us? So to explore these questions, we're going to try a little exercise. We're going to split the room in half. Fortunately, the way that it's set up makes it easy. So everybody on this side, your catchphrase is be bold. And when I point at you, I want you to shout it in unison like you're trying to shoot me like a rocket in the sky. Ready? Be bold! Be bold! This side, your catchphrase is get real. All right, I want you to say it like you're the boredest teenager in the world. All right, like get real. Are you ready? Get real. Get real. Perfect. All right, so let's try this. Space travel. Be bold. Free public transportation. Get real. Colonize Mars. Be bold. Decolonize Earth. Get real. AI superintelligence. Be bold. Cancel student debt. Get real. Build underground bunkers to survive the AI apocalypse. Be bold. Build affordable housing for all. Get real. Spend billions on weapons and war. Be bold. Invest in peace and well-being for all. Get real. You get the picture. Boldness is rationed, while realism is mass-produced. We are, in many ways, trapped inside the lopsided imaginations of those who monopolize power and resources to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Now, these futurists, they let their own imaginations run wild when it comes to bending our digital and physical realities. But their visions grow limp when it comes to transforming our social reality so that everyone has the chance to live a good and meaningful life. So how can we be bold when it comes to our social visions? I think it starts with reckoning with two stories that we're routinely told about the relationship between the future and the present, between technology and humanity. The first story on your left is what we might call the techno-dystopian narrative, the idea that technology, the robots as a shorthand, are gonna slay us. They're gonna take all the jobs, they're gonna rob us of our agency, everything bad associated with technology. And of course, Hollywood loves to sell us this, the Terminator, the Matrix, the list goes on. The other story on your right is what we would call the techno-utopian narrative, the idea that technology is gonna save us. It's gonna make everything more efficient, more fair. If only we would hand over our major decisions to these automated systems, we'd be in better hands. And of course, this is the narrative that Silicon Valley works 24/7 to sell us. They sound like opposing narratives, right? They have different endings, one in which we're enslaved, one in which we're saved, but they actually share an underlying logic, what we would call a techno-deterministic logic, which is just a fancy way of saying that we assume technology's in the driver's seat, propelled by a will of its own. And we forget the humans behind the screen, the values, the assumptions, the ideologies, desires, worldviews that get encoded into our digital systems. And as it stands now, there is a small sliver of humanity that's currently imposing their visions on the rest of us. So one of the first things we have to do as we move forward and slow down is to pull back the screen, to look at the agents and agencies that are shaping the digital and the physical realities that we have to navigate. And when we do, I think it's easier in hindsight to be critical of these agents and agencies, these individuals and worldviews, when we look to so-called deadly data, the role of a company like IBM in carrying out the Nazi Holocaust, using punch card technology, collecting data on the population as a precursor to genocide. We often associate these mass atrocities of the past with a few big bad boogeymen. But we forget that it took everyday people clocking in and out, putting their heads down, doing what they're told, not making trouble, what one author calls a bureaucracy of evil, to actually carry out genocide. And so again, we have to think, if this is the case in the past, what are the bureaucracies of evil operating right under our noses today? In what ways are we clocking in and out, putting our heads down, doing what we're told, not causing any trouble, and in that way, a part of this bureaucracy? Again, easier to be critical in the past. The challenge becomes focusing on the present, where it doesn't look like deadly data, but what we would call do-gooding data. For example, in St. Paul, Minnesota, a few years back, the school district joined forces with the police department to create what it called the Community Innovation Project. All the right buzzwords, right? Community, yay, innovation, woo, project, who could argue with that? All the right buzzwords, but what's happening behind the screen? This was a data sharing project that purported to collect data on young people in the city in order to figure out which youth are high risk or at risk of becoming future criminals. They didn't use that word exactly, but when community members got wind of this and started looking under the hood at where this data was coming from, attendance records, suspension records, whether kids were involved with child protective services, whether they had family members in jail or prison, they said, hold up. All of the sources of this data are coming from institutions that have never worked in the best interests of our young people. Why now, under the guise of the Community Innovation Project, should we even trust that this is actually going to help? So over the course of the year, they met, focus groups, town hall meetings, and eventually they put an end to this project. But not only that, they said, give us the resources that you are about to pour into this data sharing platform to label our young people, further stigmatizing them under the guise of helping. And let us decide what will actually empower them, actually serve their well-being. And so again, they did two things at once. They were critical and creative. They understood what they didn't want, but they also invested in what they did want, what they wanted to create, a model for how we have to go forward. Marrying these two capacities in our pedagogy and our curricula, thinking about how not to just create critical thinking, as the saying goes, but creative vision, so that we can actually imagine and craft the world that we want to live together in. And when we do that, we have to reckon with the fact that many things distort our vision, Racism and interlocking processes make it very hard to understand the patterns around us, why things are operating the way they are, how they're affecting our interpersonal dynamics, even distorting how we understand ourselves through a false lens of superiority and inferiority. And this, of course, is a global phenomenon, not unique to the US. It takes a particular form here, but places like France that uphold a colorblind ideology. They don't even want to talk about race, collect data on race through some magical thinking. They think that will help it disappear. Don't look and it'll go away. And yet, when you talk to people who are experiencing racism in France, migrants, Muslims, you get a much more accurate reading of what's happening beyond this mythology of colorblindness. Somewhere like India, which is where I was born, caste hierarchies, cross-cut with colorism, naturalized using the idea of religion, that these hierarchies are ancient and immutable. And yet when you talk to people who experience the underside of this society and these hierarchies, you get a much more accurate reading of social reality. Moving on, somewhere like Japan, which is where my sister-in-law lives, that from the outside may appear to us to be a homogenous society, but have many fault lines of their own, including the second-class treatment of Japanese of Korean descent, discriminated in housing, in healthcare, and education. And so while it looks homogenous from the outside, these fault lines persist and shape people's life and death chances. Last stop on our global tour, a place like Brazil that has a mythology that it's a mestiçaje, multicultural democracy. Racism is the problem of you people up north. But when you talk to Afro-Brazilians, you get a much more accurate reading of reality and the deadly fault lines that persist. And when we do this, we look place to place, we see that these distortions happen in different ways because of these histories. We might be tempted to think that somehow this is human nature. We just have to live with it. We're tribal. We are fearful of people not like us. It's in our DNA, some might assume. To come to that conclusion, we would have to ignore the way that these distortions have been created over time and passed down, very deliberately, very craftily, and especially the role of science and scientists in erecting this racist architecture that we continue to inhabit today. I make this point because we are tempted sometimes to think, oh, racism and these other, systems of domination, it's about ignorance. It's something that happens in the backwoods, people who just don't know, and we're therefore enlightened. That ignores, again, the role of the so-called learned in creating and disseminating these ideologies. The role of science and scientists. And I want to make this point because in my view, if these are the key architects, it means that the learned, i.e. you and me, higher education, K through 12, we are responsible for dismantling these hierarchies and this architecture and erecting something new. We can't outsource this. It's not saying, oh, this is political, we gotta let those people take care of it. It started in the belly of these citadels of learning. And I'm going to give you one example of many we could talk about. Renowned French naturalist, shown here, Georges Cuvier. If he was alive today, he would have all the NIH grants, all the National Science Foundation money and awards. He was very mainstream. And I say that because sometimes when you hear these views, we think, oh, this is fringe science. No, he was lauded, respected. What did Cuvier have to say? The white race, with oval face, straight hair and nose, to which the civilized people of Europe belong, and which appear to us the most beautiful of all, is also superior to others by its genius, courage, and activity. To which, of course, he compared the Negro race, marked by black complexion, crest of woolly hair, compressed cranium and flat nose, projection of the lower parts of the face and thick lips, evidently proximate to the monkey tribe, the hordes of which it consists have remained in the most complete state of barbarism. So much going on here on this, just two little excerpts. I'm just going to point out a couple things before moving on. One is to take note of this juxtaposition. If we imagine ourselves in this racist structure, we see the purported superiority of whiteness needs a foil. It needs something to always be compared to. And one of those foils is the supposed inferiority of blackness. So these are twin pillars holding up this architecture. It's a juxtaposition that's essential for holding it up. The other thing to note is that Cuvier is not just remaining in the realm of the abstract, vague generalities. He's mapping these distinctions and distortions onto something seemingly concrete, namely the human body. Why go through all the trouble? I mean, he did study after study, published his findings, went on speaking tours. Why not just spout these judgments and move on? Why try so hard to base it in science? Because the more that he and his colleagues could convince us that these were scientific truths, they were immutable, fixed, God-given, the less likely we would be to question it, much less try to change it. So one of the ways to think about the durability of racism over time is because it has been so linked and legitimized through science, through biology, that we think that these are immutable in our bodies, rather than projections and ways of being socialized. The last thing I'm going to say before bringing us back to the present is that when we hear these examples of scientific racism in the past, we're maybe tempted to, kind of defend Cuvier. He was a man of his time, we hear. We can't project our values onto him from the 21st century. That would ignore the people that lived in Cuvier's own time, who were already questioning, who were already refuting these lies, including his own student, one Frederick Tiedemann. Tiedemann initially went to go sit at the feet of Cuvier, learn everything he could. Again, he was big time. And then Tiedemann started to read and read and read and realized that his so-called teacher was not only a bigot, but his science was all bad. Tiedemann started to do his own studies that actually underscored the inherent interdependence, the inherent oneness of humanity. And so this is a lesson for us, especially the students in the room. Just because something's published, don't make it right. And that you have the rights to question the paradigms that are being passed down to you, like Tiedemann, like other students before him, who went and actually did the work and understood that what their teachers were spouting was wrong and harmful. And so when we take these lessons and we bring it to our present, where there are a number of things being sold to us as part of this package of the future, including AI. We have all these buzzwords like deep learning as one of the hallmarks of what makes this set of technologies so sophisticated, the computational depth. But what I want to suggest is that computational depth, without social and historical depth, ain't that deep. Right. In other words, in my view, it's superficial learning, because what we have now is a whole cadre of technologists that are creating fixes for society, and they don't know anything about society. That part. They have an elementary, a 101 understanding of the world that they're trying to fix with all of these tools. So this is an invitation for us in education to think about what is essential knowledge. How do we create these silos where we're graduating, cohort after cohort with a very narrow skill set, but a big ego, to think that they can create fixes without knowing the society and the history in which they're operating. It's an invitation for us to think about these hierarchies of knowledge in which we have the so-called hard sciences, the soft sciences, the humanities, the arts in the basement. And understand that precisely because of those knowledge hierarchies, we have the problems when it comes to technological development out in the world, because of how what's on the bottom is not being prioritized. And so how do we move forward? One very basic sort of example that I like us to think with in terms of dismantling one set of structures and erecting something that's more livable, is the simple park bench. I took this photo in Berkeley, California, which is where I went to graduate school. And when I took this, it was the middle of February. It felt a lot like it did today when I left New Jersey. And I was hungry for some sunshine, some vitamin D. I was living in Boston, visiting California. Oh, so many shout outs. All right. And I wanted to lay down on this bench for a few minutes between my meetings and realized because of the way it's designed, I couldn't comfortably lay down. So I thought those armrests serve all kind of functional reasons, literally to put your elbows on, elderly getting up and down. When I was 9 months pregnant, it could come in handy. But my mind went to probably what many of you are thinking. Those armrests prevent people from comfortably sleeping on the bench. This is the Bay Area, after all. With the tech boom, the housing crisis has grown exponentially. At one point, 1 in 3 school children were unhoused in Palo Alto with this tech boom because of displacement, higher rents, evictions. So I did a little digging, and I found it's actually a global phenomenon. Again, I found single occupancy benches in Helsinki, only one booty at a time, no laying down there. I found caged benches in France. In this case, you gotta pay to enter. The mayor of this town installed these on Christmas Eve, but within 24 hours, the people in the town rallied together to have them removed. Which reminds us, we don't just have to submit or click submit. We can work together to ensure that our public space, as well as our public policies, reflect our higher values. But my favorite example of the bench is the metered bench that actually have spikes built into the structure. You'll be relieved to know that, okay, so you feed the meter, the spikes retreat about 15 minutes, so don't get lost in your favorite Harry Potter book because the spikes will come out. But this was created by a German artist to get us to think critically about the design of not just public space, but public policy, the metering of social life, how something can be nominally for everyone, but because of the design, it can have these forms of harm or exclusion built in. So what if we think with the bench? We ask ourselves, what are the spikes in our classrooms? What are the spikes in our curricula? What are the spikes in our digital structures? For many of us, we're not designing the bench from scratch. We're starting a new job, a new role, and we start to notice the spikes. Then the question becomes, do we just put our heads down, do what we're told, not be a troublemaker? Or do we look around and see who else notices the spikes? And do we do something about that? And the fact is, when we apply the bench metaphor, and we think about the latest round of Gen AI that is causing a lot of chaos, especially in education, there are more obvious and more insidious spikes. We hear a lot about the inaccuracies and fabrications in these systems, the biases and stereotypes that are routinely produced through the outputs. Then there are the data privacy issues, the fact that it's scooping up so much data, and then presenting it to us magically like it's brand new. But there are less obvious spikes as well in these systems that I want us to think about and how we incorporate into our pedagogy. There's the people behind the scenes who are actually cleaning and coding and doing the data work to make these AI systems appear magical. What some call the artificial intelligence, doing the ghost work behind these systems. So that's a whole set of ethical issues that we need to wrestle with. And then there are the environmental costs, the energy use, the water use taken to train even a single algorithm has been calculated to be equivalent to the lifespans of 5 cars. And so we need to think about what's hidden behind the scene, even if it offers conveniences for us, what's happening to get to that point. So again, obvious versus insidious. Obvious, like this bench in South Africa, we see the harm, it's written all over. We don't need rocket science to figure this out. The challenge becomes, like the Community Innovation Project, when the surface seems very inclusive, very welcoming, and yet the underlying structure hasn't changed much, right? In many ways, we are the rainbow bench. We think about what is presented to the public as progress, and what's happening behind the scenes is business as usual. And we can think about a number of examples in this way in the context of work. This is an old school type of discrimination, an obvious spike. Now we have algorithms making hiring decisions that are reproducing many forms of discrimination, right? We think of as progress, but it's just reproducing and encoding. In police work, we have obvious harms like the profiling of black men. In this case, these were the images that police in North Miami were using for target practice before they hit the streets. So no wonder the rate of police brutality for black men. But then there are insidious spikes in policing when it comes to policing technologies, wrongly accusing people using facial recognition that get less attention, sold to us as progress. Moving on from policing to our domain in education, we know that anti-blackness specifically infects every level of our education system. In this case, researchers at Yale put eye tracking technology on preschool teachers and said, look for the challenging behavior. And the vast majority of teachers' attention went to the little black kids in the playgroup, even though they were behaving the same way as everyone else. They were hired child actors, instructed on how to behave. And so again, obvious, so some might say, let's throw some technology into the mix to bypass this bias in education. And yet, through one of the first audits of what's called the Student Success Predictor Score, another one of those ones that are trying to label students low, medium, and high risk, these researchers found large disparities in which black students were labeled high risk at quadruple the rate of their peers. And so throwing technology into the mix doesn't get us as far as we think. Last stop on this tour, thinking about the obvious spikes in healthcare, there's social science piled to the sky that reflects the many forms of discrimination from medical students on up. And so we might think, okay, algorithm, technology will help us bypass this human bias. And yet, through one of the first audits of a widely used healthcare algorithm, black patients were pushed out of needed programs where they would have received more care and attention from their providers. Again, sort of outsourcing these decisions to automated systems doesn't get us as far as we think. Why? Because not all speed is movement. It's what I call the new Jim Code. Because in my grandma's era, she would have walked up to a hospital and seen a big whites only sign or an arrow pointing to the Negro wing, so the spike was in her face. Now I can walk through the front door, but there may very well be a healthcare algorithm making decisions about my care, creating the same pattern of resource allocation that a prior era received in a more straightforward way. And so, whereas she lived through the Jim Crow era, now we have the new Jim Code, this combo of coded bias and imagined objectivity. And so it really comes down to a few fundamental questions, one of which is, who do we see? Who do we acknowledge? Literally, the fact that many of our technologies can't even detect darker skin, as this picture reflects. But the question is not just being excluded, or the issue rather, or being left out. It's also being watched when you don't want to be watched. That is the surveillance infrastructure that's creeping up and infecting all of our institutions, from not just policing, healthcare, education, and more. And so we can't just demand inclusion uncritically, right? We can have diversity and we can have domination in the same frame. Plantations were very diverse places, but we wouldn't call that liberation. So we have to move beyond simple calls for inclusion and diversity and ask ourselves, what are we being included into? Moving on, thinking about who we see, I'm going to share with you one short clip that offers a lighthearted take on this question, and then I'll start to conclude.
Hello? Motion sensors. Motioning. Please sense me.
Oh, one other thing. Lem mentioned that there's something weird going on with the motion sensors in the lab.
Oh, yeah. We replaced all the sensors in the building with a new state-of-the-art system that's going to save money. It works by detecting light reflected off the skin.
Well, Lem says it doesn't work at all.
Lem's wrong. It does work. Although there is a problem. It doesn't seem to see black people.
people? That's more than weird, Veronica. That's basically, well, racist.
The company's position is that it's actually the opposite of racist because it's not targeting black people, it's just ignoring them. They insist the worst people can call it is indifferent.
We never should have let that white guy off.
Wait, black man in an elevator.
Of course the white guy's gonna get off.
Veronica? Oh, God, this looks way too aggressive.
No, it's okay. I think I know why you're all here. Well, most of you.
I have something prepared. Veronica, you are a terrific boss.
Thank you, Lem. I'll take it from here. Let me start by apologizing on behalf of Viridian for this inexcusable situation.
I laid into Veronica pretty good. I figured it was my only shot, so I took the gloves off.
Sounds great, Lem. Sounds like you gave the company a really strong message.
Oh, heck. She's out there working 24/7 to make things right. Can you believe this?
I know, isn't it great? We all get our own free white guys.
You like it?
Yeah. Hey, Todd's the best. He anticipates everything I need. Plus, he picked up my dry cleaning. Oh, and he got this kink out of my neck.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, my guy sucks.
Well, maybe you're just not using yours right.
Yeah, maybe it's on you, dude.
Shut up, Stu.
I got the worst black guy.
It turned out Lem had also been thinking about the money issue, and he put together some interesting numbers to show us. And then we all went to speak to management in a language they could understand, within a margin of error of plus or minus 1%. And so, if the company keeps hiring white people to follow black people, to follow white people, to follow black people, by
Thursday, June 27, 2013.
every person on Earth will be working for us. And we don't have the parking for that.
All right, so that was a clip from a show, Better Off Ted, that's now off the air. I think it was too subversive for its time. And the reason I like it is because it shows how a superficial corporate diversity ethos, along with prioritizing efficiency over equity and the default whiteness of tech development, all work together to ensure that innovation, i.e. those sensors, literally produces containment. The fact that darker skinned employees can't use elevators, open doors, water fountains, all treated as a minor inconvenience in service to a greater good. But good for whom is what we have to continuously ask. And the real genius of that clip is using that iconic image of the water fountain from a prior era of racial domination to show how it comes back as the solution to the new Jim Code. And so again, who do we see in the process? And where do we go from here? When we apply that metaphor of the bench, we have to ask ourselves these questions and try to identify the forms of coded inequity in our own work. We have to imagine new patterns of thought and action in the fine print, not in the big platitudes, not in the fancy events, not on the websites, but behind closed doors, in 6-point font, where decisions happen, is where we have to really think about change. And the last element of going forward has to do with how and who we do it with, enacting just alternatives with those most impacted by the harmful status quo. Diversity not as cosmetic, but as a sign of insight and experience that we need in order to really frame the problem and build accurate solutions. And so I want to give you an example of a team of researchers that did just that. They did the homework, we might say. They understood the deep-seated health disparities that infect our system of healthcare, the everyday forms of anti-blackness. And they said if we train this AI to predict what doctors are going to say about patients' pain, knowing that that pain is routinely undiagnosed, underestimated, then this AI system is just going to reproduce that problem. It's just going to be encoded in software. So what they did was they shifted where they looked for knowledge. They said we can't use doctors' reports. We have to turn to patients and their own self-reports of pain so that the predictions became both more accurate and less biased because they questioned the typical source of knowledge and went to the embodied experience knowledge of everyday people. Similarly, in education, we have to listen to learners. We can't follow the hype and the marketing of the people that are trying to sell us all of these ed tech tools. In Brooklyn, students walked out because in their high school, after this online program was used, they got like 15 minutes a week with their teacher, and they were like, no, hell no, that's not real learning, and staged a walkout. In this town in Kansas, an entire town revolted because especially kids with disabilities were getting headaches, seizures, having all kinds of adverse reactions to sitting behind these screens for so many hours. So we have to listen to those most impacted. We have to develop what my colleagues here call racial literacy in tech. This handbook is free to download and includes 3 goals: to develop and cultivate an intellectual understanding of how structural racism operates in algorithms, social media, platforms, technologies not yet developed; an emotional intelligence concerning how to resolve racially stressful situations in organizations; and most of all, a commitment to take action to reduce harms to communities of color. And when we do, we realize students are in many ways on the front lines. We have here an example of college students refusing to even apply to certain companies that have surveillance systems, working with ICE, working with police and military. We have young people developing pedagogies of educational dignity. Here are students in my own lab, where we can think of pedagogies of educational dignity that recognizes the power of students to read the world, make meaning, and act with intention and efficacy. 2 of the students here were profiled in a recent Boston Review article where you can learn more about how they are braiding those twin capacities, being critical and creative. Here the headline points to what they're critical about, digital surveillance, but what's not shown is that Peyton on your left is applying this to the realm of fashion and thinking about how to create fashion that's anti-surveillance. And Kania is a short story and fiction writer, creating worlds in that she's imagining a world without these systems of domination. So being critical and creative have to go hand in hand as we move forward. So a final proposition is this, when we look at all of these different areas where these distortions persist and infect our vision, we have to not be overwhelmed by the immensity of the problem, because in every way, in every place we see the problem, that's a potential for us to act and imagine differently. If inequity is woven into the very fabric of our society, that means each twist, coil, and code is actually a chance for us to weave new patterns, practices, and politics. The vastness of the problems that we're up against will be their undoing once we accept that we are pattern makers, that we don't simply have to carry on these outmoded ways of doing things, these habits of thought and action that we've inherited. We can actually do and choose differently. And so what does it look like, very practically, to change seemingly entrenched patterns using technology for a liberatory future? I've just come to you from 2 very overwhelming days in a parallel reality. My lab, the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, hosted this symposium around the Phoenix of Gaza XR exhibit, created by and for Palestinians and those who believe in the seemingly radical notion that all life is sacred. It was 2 days. Of walking around a virtual Gaza, captured with a 360-degree camera before and after the most recent devastation, looking directly into the smiling faces of children playing in a park, standing next to a teenager passionately reciting poetry, peeking over the shoulder of a group of elderly women in a sewing circle, and walking through the rubble of once magnificent churches, mosques, bathhouses. It was a lot to take in. By the way, just as a side note, you can invite the exhibit to your own school by visiting the GazaXR.com website. So the symposium that my lab organized included also in-person testimonies from survivors. A mother of 3 who now lives in New Jersey. Her name is Arij Hamuda, who has lost over 60 family members over the last year. She was joined there with her son, one of her sons. Also, we had celebrated poet, teacher, and father of 3, Musab Abu Toha, whose harrowing escape is chronicled in the New Yorker. And he was with us for the symposium each day. He opened it with his poems. Musab described how he now wakes up every day to news that one of his students or relatives has been killed. Can you imagine seeing one of your beloved students' name on a list of martyrs each morning? And yet, amidst the genocide, our Palestinian kin are lovingly, stubbornly focused on preservation. For Musab, it means preserving his grief and pain in poetry. For the Phoenix of XR VR team, it includes preserving images of once beautiful buildings, cultural events, arts, dance, religious sites before and after the genocide, and even preserving the contours of entire villages digitally. They're cultivating in their imagination, imagining freedom, imagining returning to their land and rebuilding. They're planting mints and yellow roses amidst the rubble, not giving up. And if they are not giving up, who are we to give up? And so, here, for me, it raises the question, what is the role of teachers? What is the role of teachers in this midst? You know, we started the symposium with the words of beloved writer and teacher Refat Al-Arir. So I thought I would share with you the words of one of his students, Eman Bashir, who published a tribute to Refat yesterday, which was the 1-year anniversary of his assassination. Eman writes, I never liked poetry. It never spoke to me, never moved me with its rhythm or hidden meanings. Now I find myself forced to like it because it's become part of your legacy, part of what's left of you. On that note, I hate the word legacy too, she says. It feels too grand, too final, as if it erases all the small, everyday things that made you who you were. Poetry was something you loved. Now there will always be someone sending me your poem, Let It Be a Tale, pushing the white kite into my sight, asking me to read it aloud, but I won't, I can't. That one line, you must live, sticks in my throat, too heavy, too unfair. What if I don't want to tell your story? What if I want to let it rest, to let it fade quietly instead of becoming a tale, told again and again? You always found poetry in pain, but maybe that's why I resisted it. I knew one day it would demand more than I could give. It would ask me to carry you, to keep you alive through every line, even when all I want is to let you rest. Dr. Refat, she says, he found a way to connect with everyone, to make each of us feel seen in our own way. He noticed the shy girl in the back of the classroom, the one no one paid attention to, and he'd predict she'd be a great writer one day. He gave us writing prompts, pushed us to tweet more, to express ourselves, to find our voices in spaces we didn't think we belonged. He found a place for the misfits, the ones who didn't fit neatly into the boxes society had built. And he didn't just teach us to write. He kept following up with us after graduation, connecting us with job opportunities, making sure we had a path forward. His resilience wasn't just in his words, but in his unwavering belief that every voice, especially his, had to be heard. He taught me that patience wasn't just about waiting for things to change. Sometimes it was about forging ahead when nothing seemed to change at all. His patience was active, unyielding, relentless. And in that persistence, there was a lesson that sometimes the world will silence you, but you don't have to stay silent. He taught me that writing wasn't just about expression, it was about survival, about keeping your voice alive when everything around you tries to shut it down. His persistence wasn't just in his activism, but in how he saw potential in everyone he met, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. He saw it in me when I was still hesitant, unsure if I could tell my story. He saw it in students, in strangers, and even in the lost parts of himself. Iman's tribute reminds me that although Rifat is best known for his writing, I think his loving labor as a teacher is his most creative work. As he awakened again and again the creative capacity of his students to find their own path, their own loving labor, not to clone himself, but to quicken the minds and hearts of the next generation. This is a kind of immortality, I think, in which we pour ourselves into our students. And the point is not to simply idolize teachers or teaching, but to remember ourselves, to remember why we are here, what we are doing in this space, not to be stars, but to create a constellation in which it becomes unimaginable to discount the value of any life, unimaginable to allow an entire people to be annihilated. So, like Al-Arir, let's make a pact. Let's make a pact this afternoon to squeeze every last drop of ourselves into this work of world building. Whether it's on the page, on the streets, in our classrooms, whether it's writing poetry or living it. Let's do this. The very last thing I'm going to share with you to bring it home is this. As a former B-girl, and now B-girl, growing bees in my backyard is one of the things that my family decided to do during the pandemic. So I become a bee nerd, learning everything that I can. I have a bee Instagram, follow me. One of the many lessons that I've learned from these little tiny creatures, many, many lessons. But one is that, there are bees working in my backyard all summer that have filled those hives with honey. But their lifespans are so short that they're actually not gonna make it through the winter. So they did all of this labor, filling it with sweetness and sustenance, not for themselves, but for the next generation of bees to be able to survive the winter. That's in a way what we might think of as intergenerational solidarity. What do we owe the next generation? Who has created the sweetness and sustenance for us? So these little creatures are teaching us a simple lesson. And I want you to say it really cornily with me. Be visionary. We have this saying that we are our ancestors' wildest dreams, which is quite presumptuous if you think about it. I have a different question for us to go home with. Rather than that one, let's ask ourselves whether we are our descendants' wildest dreams.